At 3:30 a.m., the German officer on night duty at Army Group Center's headquarters put down his cigarette, adjusted his cap, and wrote a short line in his diary. The Russians are strangely quiet tonight. Outside, the Belarusian forest stood utterly still. Not a single flare, not a single sound. The eastern horizon was only a dark outline of pine and mist. 20 minutes later, the ground began to move. At first, it felt like distant thunder, a tremor that rolled through the wooden barracks and rattled the glasses on the table. Then, in a single heartbeat, the entire horizon burst open. 9,000 Soviet guns fired at once. The sound was beyond human comprehension. Not explosions, but a continuous metallic roar, a wall of sound that shook the earth. The officer dropped his pencil. The lamp above him swung violently, scattering light across the map of Belarus. Orsha, Vitebsk, Mogilev, the names that would, within days, cease to exist as German positions. June 22, 1944, the third anniversary of Operation Barbarossa. Exactly 3 years before, German tanks had crossed into the Soviet Union. Now, on the same date, the Red Army was sending the favor back, with interest. For weeks, German intelligence had reported nothing unusual. Reconnaissance planes saw only empty roads, quiet villages, and small troop concentrations. The Soviets had gone silent. Their artillery positions seemed abandoned. The Luftwaffe pilots joked that the Russians were too tired to fight. One lieutenant wrote to his wife the day before the attack, "The front is calm. Maybe the war will end this year." It did, for him, the next morning. When the bombardment began, German lines disintegrated within minutes. Men stumbled from bunkers, deaf and half-blind. Shells landed faster than they could count. The air smelled of cordite, damp soil, and burning fuel. Communication wires were torn apart. Command posts vanished under tons of shrapnel. At 3:47 a.m., every Soviet gun shifted fire, from the front lines to the rear trenches. That's when the infantry came. They rose from the fog like a moving forest, waves of men, silhouettes against the flames. Entire divisions surged forward, shouting over the roar. Tanks followed, their tracks grinding over the shattered ground, crushing the remains of trenches. Inside one German bunker near the town of Rogachev, a radio operator screamed into his headset, begging for artillery support. All he heard was static. In the chaos, an officer tried to re-establish order. "Hold your positions," he shouted, but no one could hear him. Within minutes, his company was gone. Reports that did make it to headquarters read like eulogies. Position 83 lost. No survivors. Battery 14 silenced. Personnel missing. Request permission to withdraw. The response from Berlin never came. By dawn, the smoke had swallowed the entire horizon. The river Dnieper glowed faintly orange from the reflection of fires. Soviet Katyusha rockets screamed through the air, leaving trails of white smoke that split the morning sky. For 10 minutes, the bombardment paused, only for the Russians to adjust their aim and begin again. Survivors would later say it was not a battle, but an erasure. Private diaries found afterward described the same nightmare. The ground opened under us. We couldn't tell what direction the fire came from. Everywhere. The sky itself was burning. The Soviet 1st Belarusian and 2nd Belarusian fronts had launched Operation Bagration, an offensive so vast that it made D-Day look small. Nearly 3 million men, 6,000 tanks, and 9,000 aircraft concentrated on a front the Germans thought secondary. Army Group Center, the pride of the Wehrmacht, was about to be annihilated. At 5 a.m., a captured German forward observer was brought before a Soviet colonel. His uniform was shredded, his face gray with shock. "We didn't know," he muttered. "We didn't know you had this many guns." The colonel didn't answer. He simply pointed at the horizon, where another barrage was already rising. In the German rear, confusion turned to panic. Units called for air support that never came. Fuel trucks exploded on the roads. Columns of retreating vehicles clogged the highways. An entire army, 800,000 men, found itself trapped in a storm it didn't understand. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Stalin was silent. He had ordered the attack to begin on the exact day and hour that Germany had invaded 3 years earlier. It was not coincidence. It was symmetry. Back on the front, the German officer who had written that line in his diary hours before tried to flee. He ran toward the river, through fields of burning wheat, clutching the notebook to his chest. He would die before noon, hit by a mortar shell near the bridge at Shklov. His diary was later found by a Soviet soldier. The last sentence on the page, written in pencil so faint it was almost invisible, read, "If this is the beginning, then there will be nothing left." By 7 a.m., 40 miles of German fortifications had ceased to exist. At noon, Radio Berlin received a brief, frantic message from Army Group Center headquarters, broken by static and explosions. It lasted only 12 seconds. Then, silence. The city of Minsk, still 200 kilometers away, waited unknowingly for its turn. And in Berlin, the morning newspapers reported, Eastern Front, stable. But nothing about that day was stable. By the time the sun rose fully over Belarus, the front line that had stood for 3 years was gone. Entire divisions had vanished. Tens of thousands of men were dead, and the Red Army was advancing faster than any army in history. The war on the Eastern Front had just changed forever, and no one in Berlin had any idea what had begun before dawn. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. They called it Maskirovka, deception, but it was more than camouflage. It was an art form. The art of making your enemy believe in a ghost, and then killing him with the real one. For 6 months before the June offensive, the Red Army prepared the greatest illusion of the war. In the forests of Belarus, they built not only roads and bridges, but entire phantoms, fake tank units, wooden airfields, cardboard artillery. From the air, they looked real. From the ground, they were perfect bait. German reconnaissance dutifully photographed them and reported, no signs of major buildup. That was the point. While the Germans watched shadows, the real armies were moving at night. Trains unloaded thousands of tons of equipment far behind the front. Soldiers marched under blackout conditions, their boots wrapped in cloth to muffle sound. Even local villagers didn't know what was coming. Everything that could give away movement, from radio chatter to the smoke of cooking fires, was banned. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, commander of the 1st Belarusian Front, later said, "We did not hide the truth. We replaced it." By late May 1944, from massive Soviet fronts, 1st Baltic, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Belarusian, were secretly converging on the same target, Army Group Center. Over 2 million men, 6,000 tanks, 5,000 aircraft, a concentration of force unseen since Stalingrad, and yet the Germans saw nothing. How? The Soviets had turned deception into science. Fake radio networks sent hundreds of meaningless messages across different sectors, simulating non-existent armies. Entire divisions spoke in Morse code, while the real ones remained silent. A special unit of signalers, trained actors of war, played out the illusion for German ears. Meanwhile, near Ukraine, a decoy offensive gathered deliberately noisy strength. Tanks rolling in circles, columns of trucks driving by day, creating dust clouds for enemy pilots to report. The Germans took the bait. They reinforced the southern front, convinced that the Red Army's next strike would mirror its last. In reality, the true hammer was waiting in the north. In April, Soviet engineers began laying what they called ghost roads, paths made from logs and gravel through impassable marshes. Hundreds of kilometers of new routes, invisible to the Luftwaffe, capable of carrying tanks. Locals recalled the sound at night, the slow, rhythmic knocking of hammers, muffled by trees. By early June, the roads were ready. Along them came the real divisions, entire armies crawling through the forest like a tide. The deception was so complete that even some Soviet officers didn't know the full plan. Orders were sealed in envelopes, to be opened only hours before the assault. When the attack began on June 22nd, German intelligence still believed it was a diversion. That morning, the chief of staff at Army Group Center telegraphed to Berlin. Local Soviet counterattack likely. Situation under control. By evening, the situation was not under control. Intercepted German radio logs from those first hours show confusion turning to disbelief. One operator at Vitebsk reported, enemy strength estimated at division level. 2 hours later, correction, corps level. By nightfall, correction again, impossible to estimate. They had no idea they were facing 4 entire fronts. Later, captured German officers tried to explain the shock. One colonel said, "We didn't think the Russians could move armies like that. We thought their logistics were chaos. But they moved an entire front, and we never saw it." Rokossovsky himself admitted afterward that even the Soviet General Staff had doubted whether such secrecy could hold. "If deception were a weapon," he said, "we'd already won before firing a shot." The irony was cruel. 3 years earlier, in 1941, the Germans had achieved the same miracle, striking deep into Soviet lines while the Red Army slept. Now the tables had turned completely. What the Germans called discipline, the Soviets turned into silence. What they once mocked as clumsy, the Russians transformed into precision. By the time the German commanders realized what was happening, the trap had already closed. In a captured Wehrmacht field report dated June 24th, a desperate officer wrote, "Enemy everywhere. We are surrounded by forces that should not exist." But they did exist, all too. 3 million of them. In Moscow, Stalin received the first coded updates. He read the words slowly, without emotion. "Fronts advancing as planned. Enemy unprepared." That was an understatement. By June 25th, the Red Army had broken through along a 400-kilometer front. Entire German divisions vanished from the map. Still, Berlin refused to believe it. The OKH headquarters insisted the attack was limited in scope. Reinforcements were ordered too late, to the wrong place. In the forests and fields of Belarus, the illusion had become reality, and the German center was already collapsing. As night fell on June 24th, the horizon glowed red. The air trembled with the thunder of artillery that did not stop for hours. Soviet commanders stood over their maps, tracing the advancing arrows with gloved fingers. They had fooled the enemy so completely that even success felt unreal. And somewhere behind those lines, in a quiet field tent lit by a single lantern, an officer wrote to his wife, "Tomorrow, we will move west again. But this time, not as ghosts." By dawn, for Soviet fronts were advancing at once, and the Germans, still staring at their decoys, believed it was all a trick. They were right about one thing. It was a trick. They just didn't know it was the last one they'd ever fall for. The sky over Orsha was not gray, it was black. Not from clouds, but from smoke. By dawn on June 26, 1944, the city burned like a furnace. Inside the German headquarters, order had collapsed. Typewriters clattered, maps lay scattered across the floor, and every radio screamed with static. One exhausted officer turned to another and muttered, "There's no one left to answer us." The Red Army had struck from 3 sides. From the north, tank brigades of the 5th Guards Army. From the south, infantry pushing through swamps once thought impassable. From above, Soviet bombers turning the roads to rivers of flame. Orsha had been the anchor of Army Group Center's defense, the vital crossroads linking Minsk, Smolensk, and the entire German front. Now it was collapsing under its own weight. By noon, the streets were chaos. Burning trucks, scattered helmets, horses screaming, and men stumbling through the smoke with their uniforms torn. The air reeked of oil and iron. A single line appeared in a Soviet report that day. "Orsha, taken in fire." In the German command bunker, the telephone lines were dead. The colonel in charge tried the Luftwaffe. Nothing. He sent runners. None returned. The sky above shook with the thunder of artillery. By 1 p.m., the 11th German Army had ceased to function. Its supply routes were gone. Its divisions had melted into the forests. Messages sent to Berlin grew shorter with each hour. Enemy breakthrough confirmed. Losses severe. Request permission to withdraw. At 14:37 came the reply from Hitler's headquarters. Refused. Stand fast. No retreat. General Ernst Busch read the telegram twice before folding it. Then, he said quietly, "We die here." Outside, the bombardment grew heavier. The ground shook with each impact. Soviet Katyushas screamed in waves, their trails slicing through the haze. Every building that still stood trembled like paper. Engineers tried to throw a bridge across the river. They worked silently, under fire, their faces gray with exhaustion. When the first vehicle crossed, the bridge snapped, taking 8 men into the current. The river swallowed them without a sound. By nightfall, Orsha no longer resembled a city. It was a field of glowing rubble. Telegraph poles smoldered. Carts and dead horses lay in the streets. Ammunition cooked off in bursts that sounded like distant applause. A German lieutenant who escaped later wrote, "We had no sense of time. The sky never turned dark, only orange." For the Soviet soldiers moving through the ruins, it was like walking through a graveyard still on fire. Their orders were simple: encircle, destroy, advance. One officer, reading a captured German manual, laughed and said, "They wrote everything about us, except how to stop us." At midnight, the last defenders tried to flee west. Small groups crawled through fields and forests, leaving their wounded behind. Some reached the next village, most vanished in the marshes. When the Red Army entered at dawn, nothing moved except the smoke. A slogan on a half-collapsed wall still read, "Germany wins on all fronts." A Soviet photographer took a single picture before the wall fell. By the next day, Orsha was gone from the German maps, erased like chalk from a board. The Wehrmacht attempted to regroup near Borisov, but it was too late. The center of the entire Eastern Front had cracked open. Rokossovsky's tanks advanced almost 200 kilometers in 4 days. The speed stunned even Moscow. Stalin reportedly said only, "Good. Keep going." In Berlin, the situation reports were filtered and softened. Newspapers printed, "Local Soviet advance repelled." The truth, that the Germans were being wiped out, would take weeks to reach them. A field radio log captured in the ruins of Orsha carried one final message: "We have no lines, no fuel, no contact. We are surrounded." That was the last transmission from the Fourth Army. By the end of June, the Red Army stood at the gates of Minsk. What had once been the strongest formation on the Eastern Front was now smoke drifting over burning forests. A captured German officer would later say, his voice barely above a whisper, "We didn't lose a battle. We disappeared." And in the silence that followed, even the victors seemed stunned by what they had unleashed. On July 3, 1944, Soviet troops entered Minsk. By the time the red flags appeared above the city, 100,000 German soldiers were already trapped behind them. For 3 days, the battle had raged like a storm with no direction. The German retreat westward had turned into a stampede. Units mixing together, divisions vanishing, officers running without orders. Roads were clogged with wrecked trucks, burned wagons, and thousands of men on foot, moving without maps, without food, without hope. The encirclement had begun almost invisibly. Soviet tank columns, moving faster than the Germans thought possible, had closed the last gaps north and south of the city. When the 5th Guards Tank Army linked up with the 1st Belarusian Front on July 2, the ring snapped shut. Minsk, the proud headquarters of Army Group Center, had become a cage. Inside it, chaos ruled. A captured German message from July 1 read simply, "We are surrounded. Ammunition low. Request air support." The reply never came. By nightfall, Soviet artillery encircled the city completely. The thunder never stopped. Buildings collapsed under the pressure of continuous bombardment. German medics worked by candlelight in cellars filled with the wounded. When the shells hit nearby, dust fell from the ceiling like snow. One survivor later recalled, "It was not a battle anymore. It was punishment." Soviet units entered the outskirts before dawn on the 3rd. They met little organized resistance. Most Germans were too exhausted to fight. Many simply raised white cloths, torn shirts, bandages, bedsheets, and waited to be taken. A Soviet lieutenant, writing in his diary that night, described what he saw. "We met them on the road, barefoot, filthy, carrying nothing. They did not look like soldiers. They looked like men who had been eaten by their own army." When the fighting finally ceased, the silence that followed felt heavier than the explosions. Minsk lay in ruins. Smoke hung low, and the smell of burning fuel mixed with summer rain. Dead horses blocked the main avenue. Soviet sappers moved through the wreckage, disarming mines left behind by retreating Germans. In the center of the city, soldiers climbed onto the remnants of the Reichskommissariat building and raised a red banner. Others scrawled with chalk on the walls, "Minsk ours again." For the local civilians, it was both liberation and disbelief. Women emerged from basements clutching icons, bread, and photographs. A few cried. Others stared in silence at the young Soviet soldiers, some no older than their sons. Meanwhile, thousands of prisoners began to gather on the roads west of the city. Entire German regiments stood barefoot in the mud, silent, heads down. Among them was General Hans von Tippelskirch, commander of the Fourth Army. His surrender was wordless, a nod, a gesture, and the lowering of a pistol. When Soviet correspondents arrived to photograph the scene, they wrote in their reports that the road to Minsk is lined with helmets. The official Soviet communique that evening read, "Our troops have liberated Minsk. Over 100,000 enemy soldiers encircled and captured." In Berlin, the news was unthinkable. The German High Command issued no public statement for 3 days. The last message received from Army Group Center, requesting reinforcements, had arrived on July 2nd. After that, there was only silence. Inside the encirclement, not everyone surrendered. Some groups tried to fight their way out, moving west through the forests of Berezina. Soviet patrols found them days later, starving, delirious, sometimes still carrying officers' maps, as if the paper itself could guide them to safety. A letter found on a dead German soldier near Molodechno read, "We march without orders. The Russians are everywhere. The sun never sets. I think I am already dead." For the Red Army, the victory was immense but surreal. They had annihilated one of Hitler's strongest formations in less than 2 weeks. The scale of it was beyond comprehension, an entire front dissolved. But amid the triumph came something else: exhaustion, disbelief, and the strange quiet that follows catastrophe. A Soviet war correspondent described walking through the captured city that night. No cheers, no parades. Only the hiss of rain falling on burning roofs. We had seen too much to celebrate. For many soldiers, the sense of victory felt almost wrong. The sight of tens of thousands of prisoners, dirty, broken, hungry, stripped the triumph of glory. One officer reportedly said, looking at the endless columns of captives, "We were told they were invincible. But this is what's left of invincibility." By the end of that week, the fields around Minsk had become makeshift prison camps. Soviet guards herded the captured Germans into open clearings, feeding them from captured rations. Many lay down and fell asleep immediately, even under the rain. When Moscow announced the liberation of Minsk, church bells rang for the first time in years. Stalin ordered a salute of 24 guns, one for each German division destroyed. But for those who had seen the city itself, it was not victory they remembered. It was the silence. A Soviet general summed it up in his after-action report. "We have taken Minsk. The road to the west is open. The war has changed." And indeed it had, because the Red Army didn't stop. They called it the rolling front. No pauses, no rest, no time to count the dead. By July 5, 1944, the Soviet advance west of Minsk had turned into something the Germans had never seen before, a front that moved like lightning. Entire divisions disappeared in hours, not days. The Red Army didn't stop to regroup or reinforce. It simply rolled forward, like a machine that had forgotten how to stop. From Minsk to Baranovichi, then to Grodno. 500 kilometers of wreckage, mud, and corpses. The Soviet tank columns stretched so far that the rear units sometimes didn't even know where the front was. Command posts moved twice a day. Roads collapsed under the weight of trucks and tanks. Still, they advanced. In a report to Moscow, Marshal Zhukov wrote, "We have reached the point where the Germans no longer resist. They run." By the second week of July, whole German regiments were surrendering without firing a shot. Soviet soldiers found abandoned artillery still warm from firing, guns the enemy had left loaded. Yet the chaos wasn't one-sided. The Red Army's own supply lines were breaking. Fuel trucks ran dry. Ammunition had to be dropped by parachute. Drivers tore down road signs to melt for spare metal. Anything that moved was pressed into service: tractors, wagons, even bicycles pulling trailers of fuel cans. A Soviet logistics officer wrote in his diary, "We call it victory, but it feels like starvation in motion." The pace was brutal. Some tank crews fought for 3 days straight without rest, eating cold rations inside their vehicles. When the engines overheated, men poured river water over them and kept driving. Sleep became a rumor. By July 10th, Soviet troops had liberated Baranovichi. On the 13th, they took Grodno. On the 16th, they reached the Neman River. Another line on the map crossed out in red pencil. Behind them lay what German officers would later call the Black Corridor. Fields littered with burned tanks, smashed helmets, and bodies too numerous to bury. In one village near Lida, a Soviet sapper found a German diary lying beside a wrecked half-track. The final entry read, "We are not retreating. We are disappearing." That phrase spread through the Red Army like folklore. Soldiers repeated it quietly as they marched, half in awe, half in disbelief. On July 15th, the weather turned against them. Heavy rains transformed the dirt roads into rivers of mud. Columns stalled. Trucks sank axle-deep. Yet the order from Zhukov was simple and relentless. Keep moving. When an officer protested that his men were exhausted, Zhukov replied coldly, "So is the enemy. The difference is, we are winning." Each day brought another ruined town, another river to cross. Engineers built makeshift bridges from tree trunks and scrap metal. In some places, tanks forded rivers underwater, crews sealing the hatches and holding their breath. The Germans tried to regroup near Białystok, but they had nothing left to regroup with. Their new defensive lines existed only on maps. What arrived instead were fragments of shattered divisions, men without officers, units without names. A captured field report from the Wehrmacht's 9th Army read, "Enemy pressure constant. No line can be established. Command uncertain of positions." By mid-July, Soviet reconnaissance planes were spotting empty trenches. The German defense had dissolved into smoke and confusion. Even Luftwaffe pilots reported, "No ground forces visible. Only fires." On July 18th, the Red Army crossed into what had once been eastern Poland. Civilians stared at the passing columns in stunned silence. For 3 years they had seen only retreating soldiers. Now, for the first time, they saw an army moving west. One Polish farmer later recalled, "We heard engines all night. It was like the earth itself was marching." In 23 days, the Soviets had advanced more than 500 kilometers. No army in history had moved so far, so fast, on land already destroyed by war. But victory came at a cost. For every mile gained, there were bodies lying in ditches, German and Soviet alike. The Red Army was devouring itself as it pushed forward, burning through fuel, food, and men faster than Moscow could replace them. Still, morale was unstoppable. Every soldier felt it. The war's tide had turned forever. They could smell Germany now, just beyond the horizon. A correspondent from Pravda wrote after visiting the front, "They do not speak of rest. They speak of Berlin." The Germans called it the Summer of Annihilation. Historians later called it Operation Bagration. For those who lived it, it was simply 23 days of thunder and exhaustion, of roads that disappeared into smoke, of soldiers who slept standing up, a victory that felt almost too fast to be real. And when they finally reached the Vistula River, standing on the new border of Poland, the soldiers looked west and saw the clouds glowing in the sunset. Someone whispered, "Germany is next." By July 28th, the Soviet spearheads had reached the outskirts of Warsaw. The once unbreakable German Eastern Front was gone, and in its place, only one line remained, the last wall before Berlin. In Hitler's headquarters, the maps still showed the front near Minsk. But Minsk was gone. By mid-July 1944, Berlin had lost contact with half its eastern armies. Teleprinters clattered in empty rooms, transmitting to divisions that no longer existed. The situation reports that reached the Wolf's Lair were weeks old, rewritten to sound hopeful. Hitler still believed the Red Army had suffered heavy losses and that a counteroffensive was possible. The generals around him knew better, but silence had become their only defense. At a staff meeting on July 14th, Hitler struck the table so hard the ink bottle burst. "The line will hold," he shouted. "It must. The Russians are exhausted." No one replied. The truth was that there was no line anymore. From Vilnius to Brest, the German front had simply dissolved. What remained were pockets of men fighting in forests, guided only by rumors and fading discipline. In the east, entire divisions were marching west without orders, chased by an army they could no longer see. Only here, somewhere beyond the smoke. General Heinz Guderian, recalled to assess the situation, described it later in his memoirs. It was not a front. It was a wound, bleeding faster than anyone could stop it. Even as he spoke, Soviet columns were already approaching the Vistula River. The German intelligence service tried to estimate Soviet strength. Their guess, 3 million. The reality was closer to 5. The The Wehrmacht had no reserves left to match it. The last panzer units were skeletons, tanks without engines, crews without fuel. Inside the Führer bunker, maps still carried neat blue arrows for planned counterattacks. But by July 20th, most of the units they represented were gone. Then came the sound of an explosion, not from the front, but from the Wolf's Lair itself. The failed assassination attempt by Claus von Stauffenberg shook the headquarters more deeply than any Soviet advance. For the first time, Hitler realized the war was no longer outside the walls, it was inside them. While Berlin hunted conspirators, the Red Army crossed the Bug River. On July 22nd, Soviet reconnaissance units entered Lublin. Local civilians watched them in disbelief. German occupation banners still hung from balconies. The next day, they uncovered the remains of the Majdanek concentration camp, the first camp liberated intact. The images of its gas chambers and ashes reached Moscow within days. Stalin ordered photographers to record everything. In Berlin, Goebbels dismissed it as propaganda. But the pictures were real and soon printed around the world. Meanwhile, on the ground, the Soviet advance slowed only because their supply lines couldn't keep up. Commanders complained of running on air and will. Some tank crews used captured German fuel. Others drained alcohol from abandoned trucks and mixed it with gasoline. Still, they kept moving. A captured German officer near Seidels told his interrogator, "We were told the Russians were savages, but they are machines." In the ruins of the Eastern Front, those words rang true. Hitler refused to evacuate Warsaw. He ordered new defensive lines drawn along the Vistula and the Carpathians, demanding reinforcements that didn't exist. When an officer informed him that the 12th Panzer Division had only 5 operational tanks, Hitler replied, "Then they will fight harder." The meeting ended in silence. By the end of July, the Red Army had advanced more than 600 kilometers in 30 days, farther than Napoleon in a season. The once mighty Army Group Center was gone. 57 German divisions destroyed, over 400,000 men lost. In the halls of the OKH command in East Prussia, a young signals officer filed a report stamped urgent. It contained only 3 words: "No front remaining." The paper never reached Hitler's desk. For the men at the front, the war's geography had shifted forever. Rivers that had once seemed distant now lay behind them. Cities like Minsk, Smolensk, and Orsha, once names of triumph, were now just coordinates in the ashes. A Luftwaffe pilot who barely escaped capture described the retreat in his log. "We flew west looking for the front. There was nothing, only smoke." In Moscow, Stalin received reports with a rare smile. When one general warned that the army was exhausted, Stalin said quietly, "So is the enemy. Keep going." By July 30th, Soviet tanks reached the eastern banks of the Vistula. Across the river lay Warsaw, the last stronghold before Germany itself. That night, a message went out from Zhukov's headquarters to all units. Operation Bag Ration complete. Prepare for the next phase. The greatest German army on the Eastern Front had been erased in 30 days. But for the millions who survived it, soldiers, prisoners, civilians, the war was far from over. Because beyond the Vistula, another storm was waiting to begin. They called it Victory Road. But for 40 miles, there was no road, only burned tanks, twisted tracks, and the silence of 300,000 dead men. By the first week of August 1944, the thunder had stopped. The Red Army stood at the Vistula River, staring west across the water toward Warsaw. Behind them stretched a wasteland of ash and wreckage, the trail of Operation Bag Ration. The soldiers called it the Dead Road. A Soviet sapper wrote in his diary, "We advanced faster than our own dead were buried." For a month, they had lived inside motion itself, marching, fighting, sleeping, standing up. Now, when the movement ended, silence felt like suffocation. The men were starving, their tanks bone dry. Trucks stood abandoned on the roadside, their tires melted, their engines silent. Horses dropped dead in their harnesses. The summer air was thick with heat and the smell of rot. Flies covered the faces of the fallen. Crows circled over the wreckage. The Red Army had reached the gates of Poland's capital, but they had nothing left with which to move. Fuel had run out. Ammunition was nearly gone. Communications broke down across entire fronts. The great machine that had crushed the German center had simply outrun its own heart. Commanders sent frantic reports to Moscow. We can see the city, but we cannot reach it. Across the river, Warsaw burned. On August 1st, the Polish Home Army rose against the German occupiers, believing Soviet tanks would arrive within hours. They waited, listening to the distant rumble of artillery, but the Red Army stopped. Orders came down to hold the line, to regroup, to restore supply. For the men on the eastern bank, the decision felt like betrayal. A platoon commander later recalled, "We watched the city through our binoculars. We could see the smoke, the flashes. The Poles were fighting and dying, and we just stood there." Some soldiers tried to cross the river on makeshift rafts. Most drowned or were shot by German machine guns before reaching the other side. Those who survived were court-martialed for unauthorized action. At night, the flames from Warsaw glowed on the horizon like a second sunset. The soldiers on the eastern bank could see everything: the burning rooftops, the flicker of gunfire, the endless smoke, yet were ordered to remain still. An American diplomat in London wrote in his report, "The Soviet advance, unprecedented in speed, now halts. The cost, unspeakable." But it wasn't only exhaustion. Some whispered that the pause was deliberate, that Stalin wanted the Polish uprising to fail, so that when his own forces entered, the country would be his alone. The soldiers didn't speak of it aloud, but they felt it in their stomachs, that cold, bitter truth that victory could also be a weapon. A young Soviet radio operator, 20 years old, wrote home, "I can hear them fighting. We are so close I can see their church spires. But our orders are to wait. Tell mother that waiting is harder than war." In the forests behind the lines, hospitals overflowed. Doctors operated under canvas tents, cutting by lantern light. One medic later said, "There was no morphine left. We gave men vodka or lies." The bodies of horses lined the ditches. The men didn't bury them. They were too weak. They just stepped over them, heading nowhere. Still, the Germans feared the Red Army even in its silence. For them, the pause felt like a storm gathering strength. Reinforcements were rushed toward Warsaw, though everyone knew they would die there too. When the Soviets finally received fuel, it came too late. By mid-September, the Warsaw uprising had been crushed. The city was rubble, its people slaughtered. Across the river, Soviet soldiers stood in stunned silence. One remembered, "We heard the gunfire stop. That was how we knew they were all dead." The Red Army buried its dead by the Vistula, not from battle, but from exhaustion and disease. They dug shallow graves beside the tanks, using helmets as shovels. Then they waited, for orders, for strength, for something like an end. Journalists who arrived weeks later described the scene. Roads that were not roads, just lines of bones and burned metal. The air smelled of iron and dust. There were no birds. They called it Victory Road. But victory had never looked so hollow. When reports reached Moscow, the language was clean and triumphant. Soviet forces have reached the Vistula. Strategic objectives achieved. Nowhere did it mention the fuel, the hunger, the waiting, or the city burning across the river. For the men who stood on the banks of the Vistula, watching the glow fade over Warsaw, it was not triumph they remembered, but stillness. A Soviet captain wrote his final note that summer. "We thought victory would sound like thunder, but it sounds like nothing at all." And beyond the smoke, Warsaw kept burning, unseen, unanswered, alone. In Soviet newspapers, the headlines shouted total victory, but the numbers never added up. By the end of August 1944, the Red Army stood at the Vistula, its banners raised over the ashes of Belarus. The state radio called Operation Bagration a decisive triumph, a historic blow, the destruction of Hitler's Eastern power. Every report sounded absolute, final, glorious. Yet inside the archives, the arithmetic told a different story. The German Army Group Center, 4 field armies, had ceased to exist. 57 divisions erased. Over 450,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. Thousands of tanks and guns lost. Hundreds of towns wiped from the map. It was, as one American historian would later write, a victory larger than Normandy, and almost entirely forgotten. But the Red Army's own losses were staggering too. Nearly 765,000 killed and wounded in just over a month. A cost too large to print in Pravda, too heavy to celebrate. One Soviet colonel wrote in a report to his superior, "We advanced on corpses, theirs and ours. We no longer distinguish which. The soldiers called it the March of the Living Ghosts. Official communiques praised their speed, 500 kilometers in 23 days. But in the field, speed meant hunger, thirst, exhaustion. The men moved not because of strategy, but because stopping was worse. From a diary found in the ruins near Brest. We didn't march. We fell forward. A doctor from the First Belarusian Front described how men fainted during briefings, then stood up and kept listening. Fuel trucks arrived empty. Field kitchens burned the pages of German maps to boil water. The victory had no shape, only motion. Captured German officers, interrogated after the collapse, struggled to describe what had happened. One said, "We were beaten not by men, but by movement." Another whispered, almost in awe, "They came out of nowhere and never stopped." The Soviet command called it the ideal offensive. But inside those same reports were notes that sounded like warnings. Personnel fatigue critical. Equipment unsustainable. Morale variable. And yet, orders kept coming. Forward. Always forward. By August 10th, the Red Army's spearheads were already beyond their logistical reach. The telephone lines ended miles behind them. Radios failed. Ammunition was rationed. The soldiers joked bitterly that the next battle would be fought with bayonets and curses. Still, the front did not break. It stretched endlessly. On August 12th, a field officer near Grodno counted how many men in his company were still awake after 7 days of marching. The answer, none. They had learned to sleep while walking. In one letter smuggled home, a soldier wrote to his wife, "We have crossed rivers, forests, and the border of what is human." But history would turn the page without them. While the world's attention fixed on the beaches of Normandy, no one in the West saw the fields of Belarus, where the war's true balance had shifted. American and British newspapers gave it a paragraph, sometimes a single line. Heavy Soviet advance continues. A U.S. diplomat in Moscow confessed privately, if this had happened in France, there would be parades. Here, they bury it under smoke. For Stalin, victory was both truth and myth. He needed the glory, but not the grief. The official casualty figures were trimmed, the maps redrawn. Even some battle reports were rewritten to sound heroic. But the soldiers remembered differently. One artilleryman, interviewed years later, said quietly, "They told us we were heroes. But heroes don't dig mass graves for their own." As autumn came, the Soviet advance finally stopped on the banks of the Vistula. Across the river, Warsaw still smoldered. The soldiers were told they had made history. Some nodded. Most stayed silent. When the final report of Operation Bagration reached the Kremlin, it contained one simple line beneath the statistics. Enemy destroyed. Objective achieved. But between those words, in the silence between numbers, lay the truth. The truth of men who marched faster than their shadows, who carried victory on their backs like a burden they could never set down. An American military analyst would later write, "In 23 days, the Soviets destroyed an army larger than the one we fought in Normandy. And most Americans have never heard of it." The Red Army had done the impossible. But no one cheered for the impossible. It was too far away, too foreign, too costly. When the guns finally fell silent, Europe had shifted west, borders, power, memory itself. And no one would ever move faster again. There are no famous films about Operation Bagration. No parades in Times Square. No generals whose names the world remembers. But on the Eastern Front, they still whisper one number. 23 days. After the war, the soldiers who survived rarely spoke of it. They came home to ruins, to medals made of tin, to silence. The Western world had already chosen its story. D-Day, Normandy, the march to Paris. Cameras were there. Headlines were ready. Bagration had none of that. It was too far, too fast, too terrible. In Soviet textbooks, it became a paragraph. In the West, it became nothing. Yet for those who were there, the ghosts of 1944 never left. A veteran from the 5th Guards Army told a historian in the 1960s, "We crossed 500 kilometers in less than a month. No one believed us. They thought we were drunk or lying." He smiled, but his hands shook. The ground believed us. The dead did. Another, a German officer who had escaped the encirclement at Minsk, wrote in his memoirs, "That was the month Germany died. Everything after that was only dying slower." The numbers were beyond comprehension. Entire armies erased, 500,000 prisoners, hundreds of towns leveled. But behind each figure was a face, a story, a silence. In the archives of Moscow, one can still find the final report of the operation. Objective achieved. Enemy destroyed. Duration 23 days. Nothing about the mud, or the hunger, or the sound of boots walking over the unburied. Nothing about the rivers that ran red or the soldiers who forgot how to speak. Those who fought in it were told they had witnessed a triumph of socialist arms. Yet many remembered it differently. They remembered the endless roads, the nights without sleep, the weight of victory that felt like grief. A nurse named Valentina Petrovna, interviewed in 1978, said quietly, "We won so fast that we forgot to mourn. The earth never caught up with us." By the time peace came, Bagration had already turned into legend, too immense to fit into memory, too inconvenient to fit into myth. Stalin never wanted a story about human cost. The West never wanted a story it hadn't seen. And so, it vanished into maps and footnotes. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary, a Belarusian newspaper printed a small article. No photos, no speeches, just a single sentence. In the summer of 1944, the land itself moved west. For most readers, it meant nothing. But for the few still alive from those days, it was enough. They knew what that meant. The thunder, the silence after, the feeling of standing at the edge of time. A Soviet officer once said, near the end of his life, "We were not heroes. We were the weight that history used to crush the enemy." His words were never published. Today, when historians speak of turning points, they mention Stalingrad, Normandy, the Ardennes. Few remember the place where an empire broke apart in a single month, where the war's outcome was sealed not by speeches, but by exhaustion, will, and impossible speed. There are no monuments that capture it properly. No soundtrack, no glory. Only the echoes of an army that moved faster than history could write its name. A single line survives in the notes of a Soviet reporter who followed the front and lived to see the end. "We thought we were chasing the Germans, but we were chasing the end of the world." Sometimes, history forgets the quiet victories. The ones that end not with cheers, but with a long exhale, the sound of men laying down their weapons and realizing they have outlived the noise. Because wars are fought with guns. But peace is built in silence. And in that silence, the ghosts of those 23 days still march, carrying a victory too heavy to celebrate and too important to forget.